Hey, I wanted to do a short video to go over and reiterate some of the key components of doing a good test correction. I think the test corrections are something where you get directly out of it what you put into it. And the more effort and the more reflection you put into it, the greater it's going to help you understand the topic, and you're going to gradually see your test grades go up and up. As far as I took a picture of a sample solution from our last test last Friday. Here's an example. You notice, unfortunately, the student did get 0 out of 2 points. But I want to point out a couple of things that I thought the student did really, really well. And for instance, the student did a great job of distributing the 2 here through the quantity. And the student also did a good job of, you'll notice, adding that 3x squared over to the other side. And right here, we would say that problem is in standard form. We've got all the terms on one side and they're in the proper order. Now, that's about where the wheels started to go off the tracks. The question did ask us to solve. Anytime you solve a quadratic, you hope it factors, but if it doesn't factor, we could go to the quadratic formula or completing the square. Here's an indication right here. If you look right here, anytime that they tell you the roots are imaginary, they're pretty much guaranteeing that this quadratic will not factor, and I would encourage you to go straight to the quadratic formula, especially because that leading coefficient was a 3. With that 3 there, it's going to make completing the square very challenging. So what you're going to see me do on the next couple of slides is not only do the correct mathematical work, but I'm also going to add some commentary, and I'm going to try to highlight some of the specific details that I'm looking for when I read your test corrections. Okay, so here's what a good test correction will look like. First of all, I'm going to rework the problem mathematically, showing exactly the same steps that I wish I would have done on the test the first time. I've just noticed I've picked up where the student left off as far as being correct. I've skipped the first 2 steps because the student did those first 2 steps perfectly. And we already talked about the fact that it will not factor. We're going to go straight to the quadratic formula. And just recall what our quadratic formula looks like. We've done a really good job of mastering this formula as far as remembering where all the letters go and so forth. And I'm just going to start to plug in these letters, or the appropriate numbers, and we'll see what it simplifies to. Okay, you'll notice I've done a little bit of number crunching, and I've gotten to this point right here where I have a negative 20 underneath my radical. And as I go to break that up, I'm thinking radical 4 times radical 5 times radical negative 1, all divided by 6. So what I've got here is that cleans up to 2 plus or minus 2i radical 5 divided by 6. And here's the magic point. Now that I've got that radical fully simplified, now I can finally ask myself, are all 3 of these coefficients divisible by the same number? Just make sure you don't try to simplify the entire fraction until you first simplified that radical right there. It's very important that we attack the radical first. I think you'd agree that all 3 of these coefficients are divisible by 2, and that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. And I'd get 1 plus or minus 1i radical 5 all divided by 3. Now the first one that I mentioned, that term right there is mandatory. We have to write the 1 there, whereas this other one that's in front of the I, this one right here is optional. We don't have to show that 1 because it's multiplying by 1 and it doesn't make a difference. Now the next thing I'm going to go to the next slide and we'll talk about what kind of comments we would make in order to show deep reflection on this question. The first thing I like to do is just to kind of make a brief comment on what I did well in the question, and you'll notice we said we did a good job of distributing and a good job of rearranging the terms so that they're in standard form. So I'm just briefly here making a comment about the fact that we did a good job of getting it in standard form, and that's where I picked up and started making my corrections. Perhaps the most important thing here is I'm going to focus on the word solve that I saw in the directions. As soon as I read the directions and saw that word, I made a note in the back of my mind that I was either going to have to try to hopefully factor it. That would be best case scenario. And if it doesn't factor, then we're going to make a decision whether we're going to use the quadratic formula or to go use completing the square. So we're really focusing on the word solve and what that meant to me the first time I saw that in the directions. My third comment's a very brief one, but again, in the directions, I saw the fact that I saw the a plus bi, and when they as soon as they mentioned a plus bi, that was a signal to me that this equation will not factor. I promise you that will be true every single time. Every single time you see a plus bi, the equation will not factor, which basically eliminated one of my options from earlier, and we're now down to 2 choices. We're either going to use the quadratic formula or completing the square. My third and final comment was I just tried to justify why I chose the quadratic formula as compared to completing the square. If you recall, the equation said 3x squared minus 2x plus 2 is equal to 0. And because of the fact that that a value was a 3, that's why I chose the quadratic formula and thought that it would be more convenient to use that than completing the square. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's what I think a good correction looks like. We showed the correct mathematical work, and then we made some brief comments about, how we would approach this problem differently in the future and what some of the key words were that would drive me in that direction. So I hope this helps, and I think if you follow this very simple plan, this very simple prescription, that you're going to see great improvements on your test grades, especially the next time you see a question similar to this one.